It has been a political week. The breakdown starts now. Good evening and welcome to the breakdown. I'm Tara Setmayer. The Rick Wilson is out doing Lincoln Project things. Well, folks, I'm back. Many of you know that this week I had the chance to guest host The View up in New York City. So Rick was holding it down without me on Tuesday, but I'm back. It was a good time. I interviewed Chris Christie, and it was interesting. You know, he's out here trying to rehab his reputation as if he wasn't one of the Trump enablers, and wrote a book about the Republican rescue and how the party needs to move forward. And I challenged him on The View. I posted the clips, and I said, buddy, that is not what today's Republican Party looks like. Like, this is a Republican Party that does not exist. He disagrees, but good luck with that, Chris Christie. That was on Monday. And then you follow up with this week. We had some headlines and some crazy things going on in the House of Representatives. And it proved my point that the Republican Party has lost its mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But stay tuned, because tonight's guest is someone who I've been looking forward to interviewing for 2 years now, actually, since she first testified during the first Trump impeachment hearing, Dr. Fiona Hill, who worked inside the White House and part of the National Security Council. She's a Russia expert, and you may remember her for her very measured and poignant and powerful testimony about Donald Trump and the domestic political errands that certain people were getting involved in there with Russia and Ukraine, and what a mess that whole White House was. And of course, her lovely accent. So stay tuned for Fiona Hill. She'll be up in a couple of minutes, and we're going to talk to her about her new book that's out called There's Nothing for You Here. And it's an amazing book. So Fiona Hill is coming up in a minute or two. But before we get to Fiona, back to the political craziness of this week. After the little Chris Christie confrontation on Monday, then we had the vote on Tuesday to censure Gosar. Or was it yesterday? That was yesterday. I don't know what day it is. It's been a crazy week. I've been back and forth to New York and DC. I don't know what day it is. This week, the censure vote for Paul Gosar. You probably remember that we have had Paul Gosar's siblings on the breakdown a couple of months ago, talking about what an awful human being he is, and how they have been speaking out against him for several years now. They even endorsed his opponent a couple years back who ran against him, because they are just so frustrated and disgusted by his behavior, by his playing footsie with white supremacists, with his role in the January 6th planning of the insurrection. Gosar's a bad guy. He's part of that group, that axis of evil, of crazies over there in the Republicans in the House, with Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And this guy, besides all of his other transgressions, about a week and a half ago, he released this cartoon. This is anime is like Japanese animation, but it's also very violent. And it was a depiction, for those who hadn't seen it, it was a depiction of him killing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and also him taking swords and it looks like attempting to kill Joe Biden. And so this is obviously very disturbed stuff. These depictions of political violence should never be glorified. We've seen what happens when this kind of stuff goes unpunished. And finally, after a lot of haranguing, Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans were forced into having to address this. Nancy Pelosi, who runs the House, obviously decided censure is the way to go. Now, for a lot of folks who don't speak Washington and don't understand the archaic rules of the House of Representatives, censure is one of those things that's been around for a long time, and it was hardly ever used in the last couple of decades. It's not used that often. But in the beginning, it used to be used a lot as a reprimand for people who, engaged in bad behavior. But it doesn't really have any teeth. It's just kind of a verbal reprimand. But they went ahead and they decided, yeah, this warrants censure. So they voted on that, and they also stripped him of his committee assignments, which does have some teeth because now he can't introduce legislation or anything. But then again, that kind of doesn't matter because people like Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, these are very unserious people. So they don't really care about whether they actually do committee work and pass bills and like propose legislation and things like that. So now they get to just hang around the Capitol and do no work and get paid by the taxpayers $174,000 a year. However, um, something was very eye-opening during the debate on the House floor about this censure resolution. I was watching this in just utter horror and disbelief. I mean, just when you think the Republican Party cannot lower itself any further, that they can't rationalize the crazy and just the moral debasement that we've seen, you'd think that now they can't possibly justify this. Well, yes, they can. And they did. One right after the other went on to the House floor. They gave minute speeches rationalizing Gosar's behavior, or they would change the subject and not acknowledge it and start talking about inflation and Joe Biden, which had nothing to do with this. They tried to say it was just a cartoon. Oh, it's political free speech. This is a double standard by the Democrats. And I mean, every excuse in the book. And it was absolutely despicable. Despicable. And even more despicable is that the final vote was every Republican voted against disciplining Paul Gosar, except for two, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. That to me is utterly outrageous. How any member of Congress, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, depicting these death fetishes, these death fantasy videos depicting killing your political opponents is very dangerous. Besides the fact that it's just emotionally disturbed and immature for a member of Congress. This guy used to be a dentist too, by the way. Imagine being his dental patient. Good God. Anyhow, but this is, uh, it blows my mind that this is still being rationalized. After January 6th, have they not learned anything at all? What is it going to take? Is it going to take someone actually getting killed? Because we already saw what happened during the Trump years. We saw what happened when immigrants were demonized. We saw what happened when the media was demonized. You had these crazies attempting to put pipe bombs at media locations. Remember that? With a target list. Remember what happened in El Paso with the mass shooter down there? And in the manifesto, they used words that came right out of Donald Trump's mouth. You think that these wackadoodles out there aren't looking at what these people are doing and how it's being rationalized and mainstream now? It's really, really upsetting and shameful, just shameful. Shame on Kevin McCarthy and every single Republican that stood by and patted Gosar in the back. Oh, we've got your back. Are you freaking kidding me? That guy? They should be ashamed of themselves. This is why they don't deserve to be in power at all. This is why we fight so hard to make sure that Republicans do not regain power as long as they continue to enable this type of nonsense, dangerous nonsense. But, they're unserious people. They are immature, unserious, grotesque people. And if you don't believe me, you don't believe how unserious they are? CPAC is coming up again. Yes, that's CPAC in February. And it's down in Florida. And they are actually advertising, proud of this, that Sesame Street characters are not invited. Nope, you're not allowed to come. Big Bird, Bert and Ernie, no, you're not invited. Elmo, you're not invited. What is wrong? What grade are we in? This is the United States Congress. These are people from Congress, from the Senate, political figures, and they're proud of demonizing Sesame Street characters because they're pro-vaccination, because they're pro a public health movement. It is astonishing to me. It really is. It makes me, every day that I look at my decision to leave the Republican Party and I go, this is why. And Chris Christie, This is the Republican Party today in its current form, not what you wish it to be, not what you wrote your book about, that you're trying to convince people that you weren't part of the enabling of all of this nonsense for the 5 years you were running around behind Donald Trump after he emasculated you multiple times, yet you were still there. But we're supposed to give you a pat on the back and say, oh, that's very good now, Governor Christie. You're speaking out now. Well, how convenient. Moving on, January 6th. Really quick, couple updates, and then I'm going to bring in Fiona Hill. So we saw this week also that the shaman, the QAnon shaman, remember this guy with the horns and the spear with the American flag on it and the face paint? He was the most recognizable character of that whole bunch out there, ragtag insurrectionists, and he was part of the first group of 30 that broke into the House chamber. He pleaded guilty a couple weeks ago, and he actually got sentenced finally this week to 41 months in prison, so about 3.5 years. The government had asked for 51 months, but the judge did 41. And this guy, some people were looking at it like, wow, that's a lot of time for what he did. And his lawyer, he tried to completely claim that he was remorseful and that he was dealing with some mental health issues and all of this stuff. You know what? I'm sorry, but you were involved in a violent insurrection. You were leading the way. He also wrote a note about to Vice President Pence talking about your time is coming. Justice will prevail or something. It was very threatening, and left it on the dais. So, too bad. Actions have consequences. I feel no sorrow whatsoever for this guy. Everybody finds religion and remorse when they're facing jail. Well, you can continue to do that and reform yourself behind bars. That's where you deserve to be. This is one of the most harsh sentences thus far. The other sentence that was 41 months was for this guy, Scott Fairlane, who attacked police officers. He got 41 months as well. So it's moving along. I'm glad to see this because without punishment, it's difficult to get these people to be deterred from doing it again. But I have to leave you with this because the shaman's lawyer had some colorful words for Donald Trump after the sentencing. Take a look.
After spending this much time talking to Jacob Chansley and learning about him, what do you think is appropriate accountability for the former president?
What do I think about his what?
What is an appropriate accountability for former President Trump?
Well, if you're asking my opinion, my opinion is meaningless. I will say that I would probably be far more effective over a beer with former President Trump, even if he didn't have a beer, because I understand he doesn't drink beer, but I'd have a beer. And I'd tell him, you know what? You got a few fucking things to do, including clearing this fucking mess up and taking care of a lot of the jackasses that you fucked up because of January 6th. Now, in the meantime, I might talk to him about some other things that I'd agree with him on. But my opinion doesn't mean shit.
Well, I'm just going to let that sit there. Yes. All right. Time to bring in tonight's guest. We're going to talk a little bit about her book, what happened her time in the White House, the impeachment hearing. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Fiona Hill with us for the first time on The Breakdown. She's also now the author of the brand new book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Fiona, it's such a pleasure to have you. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Tara. Really nice to be with you.
So I want to start with, before we get into your book, to get your thoughts on a couple of things that have been going on, because I'm sure as you're watching events unfold, you have opinions about them. Recently, President Trump former President Trump, God help me, put out this statement about this ambassador envoy over there in Europe, including Rick Grenell, that they're over there doing, I don't know what, because that's not what former presidents do. They don't have envoys or ambassadors. But Rick Grenell is someone who you are very familiar with and was one of the cast of characters over there in the Trump White House who was involved in not such honorable work. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, look, I mean, you've covered a lot of ground in many of the things that have been happening over this past week in Washington, D.C. You talked about a lot of this gamesmanship that's kind of going on in Congress right now, and some of the members of Congress that really do think that politics is a game. And I was just very disturbed overall in my time in the NSC and at the White House to see an awful lot of people who, I really respected based on their reputation or things that they had done before, service to the country, suddenly get themselves all turned around when they got into the Trump White House. And, then start to, get engaged in things that really had not a lot to do with basically national security and foreign policy. As you mentioned in the kind of introduction clip, political errands, private activities for the president, or associating themselves very closely with the president to push their own private agendas. Some of the people, including Ambassador Grinnell, actually had distinguished careers, working at in his case, the United Nations and at the State Department. They actually did want to do, work on foreign policy, but they also found themselves, as I said, swept up in this kind of circus around the president and, basically going off at all kinds of different tangents as well. And that was extremely disappointing. And I do think that it raises an awful lot of questions as we look forward, as we think about the future of the presidency and the future of people's roles there. We have to ask ourselves an awful lot of hard questions about, where are these dividing lines between private, personal interests and, national security and foreign policy, where, we used to think that all of these other games stopped at the border. We used to say, stopped at the coastline.
Right.
And we all went out as Team America. Not just Team Trump or, Team myself, to basically push forward now foreign policy issues. And certainly if people are still playing roles of private envoys, that really undercuts American, foreign policy overall. I mean, I can't speak to this particular situation, but, if it's sanctioned, officially approved by the current president, that's one thing. But if it's just freelancing, that just sends mixed messages at a time when everybody's looking at the United States and just wondering, what's going on with us? We see in opinion polls now in Europe that people no longer see the United States as any kind of example in terms of democracy, and are also wondering what the heck is going on with our foreign policy and national security policy.
And I think that's an important point coming from someone like yourself, who is an expert, who has spent her entire adult life studying this and speaking on this and working in the foreign policy realm, and someone who has studied at great length Russia and Europe and what has happened in these authoritarian regimes, and why what's happening in the United States is so concerning to so many people with historian backgrounds like yourself. In the foreign policy space, the list is long, where people are out here warning, like, listen, folks, we've seen this in history. It doesn't end well.
Right.
Most people who don't know, who are maybe watching the show for the first time and didn't get to see your testimony during the first impeachment, that was just, I think for the average American, they looked at that impeachment, they didn't know what was going on. Most people can't find Ukraine on a map. They're like, we don't get it. There was a phone call. So what? Like, what happened? Just explain briefly why that impeachment hearing was actually an important moment in history, and why Americans should care, what the significance of that was.
Well, look, I have a lot of sympathy for people who were watching and wondering what the heck was going on, because at times myself, I wondered what was going on all kinds of different dimensions. First of all, there were so many, people jumping into the action on Ukraine, that people like myself who were supposed to be, coordinating the foreign policy, the national security aspects of this. We had no idea who they were and what they were doing. So I have a lot of sympathy, as I said, for people who were just very confused by all of that.
Yep.
And then if you watch the impeachment and the testimony itself, this was supposed to be an exercise in congressional oversight, a check and balance on the executive branch and on the president himself. And of course, it was anything but. There was an awful lot of gamesmanship and a lot of grandstanding, and people like myself, who were these fact witnesses who'd been subpoenaed, actually, ordered to come and testify against, at Congress, kind of, and answer all of the questions. We were being accused of testifying against the president, rather than just giving evidence and, presenting the facts of what had happened. And we were accused of all kinds of gamesmanship and, ourselves. And anyway, the whole thing was just a hot mess. But the basic bottom line of it was that what we discovered, all of us who participated in this and everybody who watched, that there was this effort to privatize US foreign policy and national security policy. And, initially I myself had been skeptical about how much the president was involved. There seemed to be a lot of the other people, Rudy Giuliani, these Ukrainian Americans who've been indicted since then for impropriety in offering election support, that they seemed to be interested in pushing their own business interests. There was all kinds of these weird dimensions. And then it became crystal clear as a result of the phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine that the president himself was trying to orchestrate getting the Ukrainian government involved in our elections, insofar as he was asking them to open up an investigation into Joe Biden, who at that point was the most likely contender for the opposition for the Democratic Party in the 2020 presidential election. And so it was clear that he was trying to get a Ukrainian high official, the president of Ukraine, to sort of interfere in somewhere in our elections, very blatantly on a phone call. I found that personally shocking. I wasn't there for the call. When I read the transcript, like everyone else, I couldn't quite believe it. I'd never heard or seen President Trump do anything like that. But it was clearly very obvious at this point that everything was off the rails in terms of our foreign policy, national security policy, that we were no longer pushing US interests, but an awful lot of people were pushing Trump's personal interests.
And using U.S. resources as a threat, basically extorting the president of Ukraine. If you don't do this, they withheld the security financing and the security agreements that we had with Ukraine to help protect them against Russian aggression. And they didn't, they tried to lie and say, oh, that had nothing to do with it, but that was a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah, well, there was two things, actually. I mean, initially when I was leaving, there was the, question about whether the Ukrainian president would get an Oval Office meeting. And, for people listening to that, that's really important. That's an incredible symbol of US support for a country. And Ukraine was, supposed to be one of our partners, and we had for years tried to support Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and security against aggression from Russia. And then, as you suggest, Ukraine is still under attack from Russia. Then there was this whole effort to hold up security assistance that the US had already approved, on multiple occasions. And it was just being deliberately pulled back. So again, it was complicated. There were so many different actors playing around there, but there was a very clear bottom line that the president was trying to basically use national security policy for his own personal benefit and basically try to already basically hobble one of the candidates in the 2020 presidential election campaign before it even got out of the gate.
And we saw how much worse it got. And we're still learning, we're still learning from people like yourself and others. Alexander Vindman was a guest on our Lunch with Lincoln show. I'm talking about his role in all of that. And, and the common denominator here is that there were people like yourself who were not born in America, but came here because you saw America as this land of opportunity where you could, achieve whatever you wanted. And, the American dream was achievable for you. And same thing with Alexander Vindman and his family coming here for the similar opportunities, and you guys becoming American citizens and engaging in public service. And the next thing you know, you find yourselves in the middle of a historic moment of an impeachment of a president who demonizes people like yourselves, has this agenda that is so against everything that this country stands for and why you came here. And here you guys are. I think you guys are absolute patriots, not these people who were storming the Capitol, not what the MAGA world defines as patriots. What you and Alexander Vindman and all of those people who stood up and testified honorably and truthfully about the dangers of what this president was doing, you guys are the patriots and your heroes, and I thank you for doing that. In your book, you talk about so many experiences, particularly the title of your book, There Is Nothing for You Here, is in reference to your decision to come to America. And it's not just one of those books where it's like an anti-Trump book and, you're writing about all the palace intrigue. I mean, there's details about your time there, but it's so much more than that. Talk about why you decided to write this book and the significance of the title.
Well, look, part of it came from the experience in the impeachment hearings, wondering what the heck had happened to the United States that I came to in 1989, that I decided to become a citizen of, and that I wanted to serve in government, just as you laid out. there was also Ambassador Maria Jovanovic, who testified along with many other people at the hearings and in closed-door depositions, who was an immigrant, and, others who wanted to step up and help the country. And I thought to myself, like everybody else, how did we get here? How did we end up impeaching a president for this perversion of foreign policy? And, we were all being attacked. And I wanted to try to explain how we got to that moment. This upsurge of populism, kind of an approach in governance where it's all about the person who's the president, about Trump and his base, the voters and everything else, the Congress, public servants, all the other intermediaries that we take for granted normally in our democracy and society are repudiated, kind of pushed back and trashed, frankly. And I had come from, as is suggesting with the title of the book, There's Nothing for You Here, the kind of place that many Americans will find familiar from the old Rust Belt. I grew up in the northeast of England in an old coal mining town where my father had lost his job over and over again as the mines closed. He'd eventually become a hospital porter on the lowest rung of the economic ladder, never went anywhere after that. My hometown was beset by mass unemployment. Pretty much all of the businesses were closed down as well. And when I was, leaving school, my father basically said to me, look, there's nothing for you here, pet. That's, what you call your kids say pet, in the north of England. You've got to move and go somewhere else, if you're going to, find a way forward. And that was pretty devastating. I didn't especially want to leave. I loved my parents and, I liked my home region, which I think, comes out in the book. But he was basically saying there's nothing, kind of no opportunity. Mm-hmm. And my dad had always had a dream of emigrating to the United States, ironically, to work as a miner. So my dad could easily have been, one of President Trump's base, from West Virginia, Pennsylvania, you name it. That's where he would have gone and eventually lost his job there too, no doubt, because of the closing of mines and the other heavy industry. But, we saw the United States as that land of opportunity. And that's really got the full fundamental basis of American politics. Today, there's only a 7% chance to do what I did, which is move from the very bottom of the economic ladder to the top, or, in a kind of a social sense as well in America. That wasn't the case when I got here. And it's that lack of opportunity, that lack of ability for people to see themselves at the top of governance in politics or the top of the economy, that lack of access to an education, that lack of access to a great job with benefits and, basically the wherewithal to support your family that's really fed into the state of affairs today. It's the grievances, the frustration, the anger, the sense of other people of thinking there's nothing for them here either.
That's right.
It can be in a socioeconomic sense, it can also be in a cultural sense, an identity sense. They feel adrift and unmoored, and they're looking for someone to fix it for them. And President Trump fit right into that. He says, I see you, I hear you, I'm listening, I'm going to do something for you. And we've had the breakdown. You've been talking about the breakdown of the Republican Party, but frankly, people are also disaffected with the Democratic Party as well.
That's true.
And so many people in the United States today, a large swathe of the population, more than affiliate themselves with Democrats or Republicans, actually see themselves as disaffected, unaligned, independent, no matter how you want to call it, and just don't feel that the parties are representing their interests. And that's why you're getting so many protest movements. And that's really why someone like Trump can emerge and, really make a big impact. And remember, in the Democratic Party, too, who was the other candidate who was running against Hillary Clinton in 2016 and ran against Joe Biden again in 2020? It was Bernie Sanders, who's not a Democrat, a self-styled socialist, very much a populist as well, with obviously a very different appeal and a different approach to things. But, that is also emblematic of where we are as a country. I think an awful lot of people are trying to say to themselves, well, look, what can I do to turn this around? And I wanted to write that book to lay things out using my personal story, the observations of what I saw in the Trump White House and, how things have gone wrong, the peak of populism in America, but also come up with some more positive things about what we can do. There are 330 million of us in the United States, not just one guy. It's not all about one guy. Okay, a whole bunch of us are babies or the elderly and, can't really do as much or not quite ready to do as much. But there are a heck of a lot of us can get out there and change things and remind everybody that we are Americans and that we can restore that opportunity again. So I would just try to get people to think, well, what could I do about this? Instead of sort of sitting around and waiting for some guy to appear magically and do something, what could I do to change this situation?
You call that
and storming the Capitol, but
right?
What can I do concretely?
Exactly. You call that a crisis of opportunity. This lack of well, you talk about the deindustrialization of not only England, the UK, but of the United States and of Russia, and you draw a through line about how those events, economic events, led to the rise of the populist movements in all of those countries, and how there are similarities for this. And you use a phrase in your book, or you talk about, which was very jarring to me when I heard you when I read it. You said that if we don't basically get it together here in the US, that Russia is America's ghost of Christmas future.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately so. And look, people may think, well, that's a bit extreme. We're not at all like Russia, but in fact, we have a lot of structural similarities in this, mass deindustrialization after the 1980s. And the fact that there are many parts of the United States where people feel left behind, where, the economy has not been transformed, and they've got multiple generations now of people who really feel that things have not worked out for them, and that they are looking, towards a strongman president, as we know. And that's exactly what happened in Russia. Vladimir Putin's not a member of a political party. He's removed all the checks and balances. The parliament in Russia is a rubber stamp parliament. There's not an independent judiciary. You can see where I'm going with this.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're starting to see the same hallmarks. And a lot of people actually feel that they have to protest or engage in, kind of even violent protests at different times to get themselves heard. So, Putin rolled back a lot of the freedoms that Russia had developed, and the experiment in democracy after the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, all in the name of making Russia great again, strengthening the state, and addressing people's problems. And you kind of expected them to, in return for addressing their problems, economic and social problems, just to, butt out of politics. So, we can see these same trends happening here. The rollback of voting rights, the gerrymandering and redistricting to, kind of make it more and more difficult for the opposition parties to get in, the questioning about electoral outcomes, all of the court cases, all of the refusal on the part of President Trump to basically concede the election and to repudiate, the lie that he'd won, and to basically whip everybody up to try to dismantle in those, late days in power, the Department of Justice. Now all of the movements to, make sure that he has the best possible chances if he decides to run again in 2024, which I imagine at this stage that he will, to basically be able to challenge any electoral outcome that he doesn't like. So, I mean, this is not the hallmark of a vibrant democracy as America used to be. This is a hallmark of impending authoritarian turn. I mean, I think we're already there. We've already got a constitutional crisis. And that's what I mean by a ghost of Christmas future, just like in the Charles Dickens, Christmas Carol. Because it's an apparition. It's something that we should be worried by, but it doesn't mean that it has to happen.
That's right.
And that's the whole point of Christmas Carol. Charles, Dickens, I think it was a very effective use of that imagery. And, Ebenezer Scrooge got his act together. We can do that too. Look, if Ebenezer Scrooge can get his act together, we can too.
That's right. And I think Ebenezer Scrooge in this case is the American political system, with the Republican Party being the enablers here. And, they need to be shaken into changing their ways, because it's not, I mean, I spent many, many years in the Republican Party and had to denounce it after what happened with Donald Trump refusing the election results and Republican leadership enabling it. Like, he wouldn't have any oxygen if it weren't for the people enabling him. You talk about how, these institutions, they don't create themselves, and they don't protect themselves. It takes a bunch of different things, including the people, to fuel it. And that's what's so frustrating about this. In the last couple of minutes that I have with you, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a lightning round and get your take on a couple of things. What brought you to prominence in the foreign policy community as a Russia expert was this 2013 book you wrote on Putin. And you had the opportunity to sit next to him at a dinner. And there were a lot of observations that you made, and you wrote in this book about him, and you became this preeminent Russia expert. What were some of the most interesting things that you notice about Vladimir Putin that most other people don't know about? What struck you about him?
Well, look, he's extraordinary, well prepared and disciplined. I mean, sometimes he makes mistakes, but he always, and this is something that we should pay a lot of attention to, does his homework. and he kind of figures out who people are, how he can push their buttons. I mean, I think, we're all getting a clear sense of this right now. One of the dinners that I was sitting next to him, I noticed he had a big stack of note cards, and they're all written in very big font, so I could actually read them. And that also, kind of made it very clear that he's like, the rest of us, when he hit a certain age, he's short-sighted. Right. He's never going to let on. The other thing was, he never ate or drank anything, which made me a little nervous, because I thought, okay, why is he not eating or drinking? Knowing the propensity of Russians to put things in people's tea and to, poisoning, I probably shouldn't eat or drink either. But he's always trying to put people off their guard. So these dinners were highly orchestrated. I was actually sat next to him, not because I was this preeminent expert, or actually at the time I was the national intelligence officer for Russia at the National Intelligence Council. I was in the intel world, and I fantasized it might be because I thought it was like, Judi Dench, M equivalent. It was because I was a nondescript older woman who wouldn't draw any attention. And Vladimir Putin wants to make sure all attention and all eyes are on him all the time.
That's funny.
And so if there's been a guy sitting next to him, people said, who's that guy? Why is he there?
Right.
What's he? Who is he? And in other words, if it's just a woman, they're like, he's probably a secretary, which is, my common, default persona.
Right. Trump did this
thing, just a secretary. Trump thought the same thing, so, nobody would pay any attention. So everything for Putin is heavily staged. It's highly orchestrated. It's very carefully done. And he's always looking to exploit other people's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And again, at these dinners, why didn't he drink? Because he didn't want to go to the bathroom. And everybody else is basically, for hours, because he will talk for hours, and you can start to feel uncomfortable. I, realize, better to dehydrate myself, because if you want to go to the bathroom, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the bathroom, excuse yourself in the middle of, some dinner with Vladimir Putin. So it's just this cunning.
Maybe your last bathroom run
to make people feel discomforted. So he's the master of the room.
Unbelievable. And he was too vain to wear glasses because he thought it was a sign of weakness.
Oh, exactly.
These egomaniacs.
He's projecting at all times. He's always on.
Right. These egomaniacal little men, I tell you. You also talk about in your book, you brought up about being a secretary and being nondescript, how Donald Trump mistook you for a secretary, which is so insulting. I mean, you're incredibly accomplished.
So many times. I'm not, about by now. I'm just like, okay, I'm over it.
It's
and there's nothing wrong with being a secretary either. Just
no,
to be clear.
Right. No. But you are incredibly accomplished. You're Harvard educated, for goodness sakes. And they also talk about that women in the Trump orbit were considered what were they called?
Non-players.
Non-players.
Yeah, non-players
in the world, which just speaks to the misogyny that we are already aware of. One other thing about Vladimir Putin and just your thoughts when Trump was in Helsinki, and that god-awful press conference with him and Putin, what were you thinking? As someone who is an expert in this and understands the dynamics, what were you, as horrified, I presume you were, but what were you thinking right at that moment when you were watching that happening?
Well, I've said before, and I said in the book, I was actually thinking about how could I end it, kind of faking a seizure, falling into the media, fire alarm, kind of anything that could end this, kind of horror. Because sadly, this was a very predictable development. It wasn't that the whole meeting itself had been a problem, quite the contrary, actually. At times there were, what you would expect of a kind of a normal set of interactions at a summit. But it was that Trump was obsessed with Putin for what he stood for as a strong, powerful, and even used these words about Vladimir Putin. He's standing next to him. He keeps saying, I have Vladimir Putin here, and he's been very strong and powerful. For him, for Trump, Putin was the sort of the epitome of the badass president, of kind of how he saw himself, completely in charge. Everybody respects him, fears him a bit. And, he's seen as fabulously rich, fabulously wealthy, fabulously powerful, fabulously strong, fabulously in charge. That's the whole thing. He's fabulous. And he did not want to be shown up. And, there's also that whole dilemma of 2016 and the interference in the election. And so this fixation,
the Russia hoax, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. That Trump has been elected by Putin, which I just want for the record to say, I never believed that he had been elected by Vladimir Putin, but he'd been elected by the American people. And that was, all an issue in itself that we should have been paying attention to, because he is the symptom of an awful lot of other things that you and others have been referring to have been going on here in the United States. But Trump himself was really fearful of facing up to that issue of Russian interference, because it cast a whole shadow over his legitimacy and, the outcome of the election, which was incredibly close in the Electoral College. and not at all close. I mean, he'd lost in the
Popular vote.
on the popular vote. It was just this narrow 70,000 votes in the Electoral College. And I guess some at the back of his mind, he was probably worried about it as well. And what if Vladimir Putin decided to mess with him because you couldn't put that past Vladimir Putin? He'd actually said, hey, Donald, well, actually, I did interfere. And my people tell me that I got you elected. I mean, how would he have reacted to that? How would we all have reacted to that? That would have been even more of a disaster than, any of the other things that happened, because the Russians loved the idea that we all thought that they might have elected our president. What a better way of bringing the United States down to size. The great United States with much vaunted democracy, its much vaunted electoral system, and the Russians are basically being able to elect, our president, as one senior Russian official said to me, as if you were a banana republic. So they just loved the fact that we were tearing ourselves apart on this issue. And there in Helsinki, that came to a head. And also Trump's fears of being shown up in front of Putin, who is really his ideal strongman. And so, as a result of that, we saw him trying to wheedle his way out of answering the questions, trying to kind of give deference to Putin, but not too much, and trying to kind of deflect attention away from him onto his favorite conspiracy theory of the server and Hillary Clinton's emails, none of which anybody else could follow except him. And he ended up all over the place, and it became a shameful debacle.
Right, it was a hot mess, to use your term.
It really was a hot mess.
Oh my gosh. So, one last thing, and something that's fascinating to Americans, and is of course your accent, which has become something almost of a signature for you, because here in America, of course, we're always fascinated with the Brits, and there are all different dialects there, just like there are here, and that became something like in your book, and I again encourage people to read it. Here in America, we have different issues with race and sex and regional disadvantages in the education system that present problems and challenges for people to rise up in America. But where you're from in England, accent actually and class and socioeconomic status are all related. And it is something that, unless you're from there, you don't really understand. Explain just a little bit quickly about the role that your accent has played in all of this, to educate Americans about it, because I think it's cool. But if you're from, certain parts of England, they'll be like, oh, no. It represents that you actually come from a low income area and lower on the socioeconomic status. You're judged by it.
That's exactly right. Look, the area that I came from in County Durham in the northeast of England was basically the centre of heavy industry. It was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. And pretty much every industry there was coal mining, steelworks, shipbuilding, railway works, kind of big manufacturing. Everybody was essentially a worker. So the regional accent, which is also pretty distinctive, became associated with people who work as the working class. The idea if you were born there was an assumption that you were kind of blue collar working class. Now, if you added race into the mix and, some of the other issues, wow, you were really disadvantaged in that way. But this is predominantly a white area, 98%, in my hometown, for example. It was all people from Scotland, rest of other parts of England, Wales and Ireland, British, nationalities, ethnicities that moved into this area to work as the industries all built up. And it developed this distinctive accent. And so when people would meet me from elsewhere in the UK, they'd immediately know that I was from the Northeast. They might be able to place it as County Durham, but the assumption already would be that I was from the North, so I was also working class. And in the UK, people ask 3 questions of each other to put people in their little boxes. It's not just based on what you look like, but it's how you sound. But they say, where are you from? What did your father do? And what school did you go to? And that already kind of puts you in a class box. I come from the northeast of England. My dad was a coal miner, and then he becomes a hospital porter, which is downwardly mobile, not upwardly mobile. Right. And I went to a school, a school called Bishop Barrington Comprehensive School, that immediately, was one of the, kind of like a big, sprawling, public, under-resourced school in the United States. Like if somebody said that they went for a school in you name, the place that people already know is a very poor, disadvantaged area. So I was already just put in a box, and people didn't expect very much of me. Now, over time, my accent has actually changed somewhat, because when I first came to the US, people would say, oh, I love your accent, but I don't know what you've just said. I would have to start to enunciate a bit more clearly.
Yeah.
I haven't really slowed down, although I did the audio version of the book. And I had a director who said, please slow down, slow down. But now people are telling me, from home who were listening to it, they've put me on 1.5 times speed because to get back to my normal
that's
voice,
funny.
I'm speaking too slowly.
Well,
and I always thought that most Americans, not you, Tara, or people from New York, God, they speak really slowly. What's the matter with them?
Right. No, I was going to say, as from one woman to the other, that people say something about our accents. I'm from Jersey, and I say we don't have an accent.
Jersey, New York.
That's right.
We speak fast, we gesticulate.
Right. That's right. Listen, we're not the ones with the accents. It's everybody else that has the funny accents around here. Well, you, a friend of yours, one of the insults that Trump threw at you, which I thought was pretty funny, was he called you a deep state stiff with a nice accent. And it's my understanding that a friend made a T-shirt for you as a gift, because I think you should wear that with pride.
That's what the T-shirt says. Proud to be a deep state stiff with a nice accent.
Where can I get one?
It was pretty funny.
I want one.
Well, I suppose you can probably, anybody can order any kind of T-shirt. It's probably already on Etsy, kind of.
Right.
I'm not supposed to advertise, am I? But anyway,
I
have been shocked by the T-shirts with, my images and all kinds of things that have been out there. It was not what I was expecting.
Whoever would have thought,
No, I never have thought it.
Dr. Fiona Hill, it has been an absolute pleasure. I encourage everyone to read your book. It is a fantastic read. There is nothing for you here. Finding opportunity in the 21st century. The part about the solutions, if you had one bit of advice, because people watch this, they say, what can we do? You call it the infrastructure of opportunity. What's your parting advice to folks who are watching this going, well, what can we do?
Well, look, on the theme of all of your segments, one thing that people can do is go out there and try to, turn back voter suppression. Go out there and try to kind of figure out what you can do to, show up and participate in being able to get people out to vote, because I think that's super important. It isn't a partisan act. It's an act in, defense of your democracy, because it's not clear, that more people are out to vote about really how they will vote. So, that in itself is just, trying to make sure that everybody has a chance to get their voice heard. And it can also write to your congressperson and just say, hey, what's up? What are you doing here?
Right.
You actually are supposed to represent me as well. It's not just, whoever you say voted for you, but, we all as Americans have a right to representation. And then, more than that, look, you can go out and do anything in your community to, basically help people out. Volunteer at a food bank, basically volunteer in a school, particularly a school where you have a lot of privileged kids who could do with some mentoring. Anybody can do anything like that to help out and help our community really kind of pull together, get people mobilized to help out their fellow American, their neighbor, the person down the street, and stop dividing each other up into, these strange red-blue camps.
Wise words from Fiona Hill, who is a perfect example of the great American story. And we are appreciative of you. And again, I say thank you for being a patriot and helping us to save our country from that ghost of America's future. We don't need to go that way.
We don't need it.
No. Fiona Hill, thank you so much and have a great holiday season.
Thanks, Tara. All the best to you too. Thanks.
She is a fascinating woman, and I am thrilled that I had a chance to interview her. The highlight of my week was not doing The View, which was cool. It was actually getting a chance to chat with Fiona Hill, because I think she's amazing. She's inspiring, and we are lucky to have her on our side. All right, well, that is it for tonight, and I want to leave you guys with our thank you to President Joe Biden for getting something done, because that's what we needed. The infrastructure bill is good for America. It will help our communities. Speaking to the theme of Dr. Hill about the underserved neighborhoods and deindustrialization, it creates jobs. So the Lincoln Project has put out one of our latest ads, which is basically thanking President Biden for helping to rebuild America. And I will see you guys next week.
We are going to fix our inner cities and rebuild our highways, bridges, tunnels, airports, schools, hospitals. We're going to rebuild our infrastructure.
For 4 years, Donald Trump promised us Infrastructure Week.
$1 trillion in infrastructure investment. World-class infrastructure.
Infrastructure Week.
Infrastructure. We call it Infrastructure Week.
The so-called builder said only he could deliver on new roads, bridges, and airports.
I alone can fix it.
But who got the job done?
Finally, Infrastructure Week.
Joe Biden. Action, not talk. Results, not tweets. Millions of new jobs, billions for the economies Donald Trump wrecked. Serving America instead of serving himself. Joe Biden, building back better.